and start the recording. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Mei Vang, and I am with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Outreach Unit. Welcome to our 209th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. It's a really beautiful day here in Minnesota, so we are having the perfect topic that we're going to be sharing today. We have joining us today three special guests who will be helping us explore the fascinating world of early bloomers, which are called spring ephemerals. So our very first guest today is going to be Annie Gunnis. And Annie Gunnis is a board conservationist with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, where she works to improve and protect the state's water and soil resources. So her role involves advocating, educating, and partnering with local governments, including soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, counties, and other grant recipients to implement water quality, restoration, and conservation projects. Before joining Board of Water and Soil Resources, Annie spent over 7 years at the University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum, where she managed restoration projects across prairie, forest, and wetland ecosystems, as well as overseeing display gardens that showcase these specific habitats. She also led educational tours and presentations and coordinated grant proposals focused on pollinator restorations. Annie holds a master's degree in natural resources science and management, along with a certification in ecological restoration, both from the University of Minnesota St. Paul. And her master's thesis examined the trade-offs in managing bird's foot trefoil within tall grass prairies. She's really passionate about native plant gardening, ecological restoration, and conservation. And Annie is dedicated to fostering sustainable landscapes and ecosystems. So Annie, thank you for being here with us today. And then we have Susan Wilkins, who is the garden curator from Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Susan has served as a garden curator of the Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden and Bird Sanctuary for the past 21 years. And her work includes overseeing the care and development of the plant collections at the garden, which is a historic 18-acre native plant botanic garden. Additionally, she oversees the garden's education programs, visitor services, volunteer programs, and community connections. So Susan, thank you so much for being with us today as well. And last but not least, we have Andy Wendt. So Andy is an interpretive naturalist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. He currently works out of Nerstrand Big Woods State Park, but has also spent part of his 14-year career at Interstate and Forestfield Mystery Cave State Parks. He loves that his work allows him to help create memories for park visitors and share his passion for the natural world. So thank you, Andy, so much for being here with us today as well. Thank you all for joining us today. So we have a really great presentation ahead. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Annie to start us off. And then following her will be Susan and then Andy. Please let me know when you would like me to advance your slides.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, May. Thanks for having me and for the wonderful introduction. So, as was mentioned, my name is Annie Gunnis, and I am just really excited to talk with you all about nature's early risers, so our Minnesota spring ephemerals. Next slide, please. So, first off, I just want to give a brief overview of what I will be covering today since you have three speakers and we are all really excited about spring ephemerals. So, I'm going to kick things off with a bit of an overview on what spring ephemerals actually are. I'm also going to talk a little bit about spring ephemerals and how they play an important ecological role in their environments. And then we're going to dive into a little bit more about spring ephemerals from a restoration ecology standpoint before handing it off to the next set of presenters. Next slide here. So first, what actually are spring ephemerals? Well, to me specifically, they are some of the most unique and beautiful native flowers, but because they're often kind of small and they really only last for a few weeks here in sort of that early springtime, they can sometimes be overlooked. But what are they, right? So spring ephemerals are a group of early blooming plants that flower and complete their full life cycle within that sort of brief window in early spring. So spring ephemerals, they can really thrive here in our Minnesota woodlands, particularly before trees fully leaf out. So that's kind of where they take advantage of that abundant sunlight that sort of penetrates through those bare branches before the canopy of trees kind of grows thick and blocks out light from reaching the forest floor. So in this photo, we kind of have an example of our Dutchman's breeches blooming, but in the background there's also a plethora of sort of other spring bloomers, including mertensia and mayapple, that are really taking advantage of the sunlight reaching that forest floor. Next slide, please. So, to dive a little bit deeper into the life cycle of spring ephemerals. So, you know that spring ephemerals, they emerge in early spring and they really do so at a time when the soil is still cool and moisture is really plentiful. And they usually grow from perennial root systems or bulbs that really kind of store energy for the plant's brief growing season. Now, spring ephemerals, they typically flower before the canopy fully develops, kind of in that March to early May timeframe. And they're really adapted to attract early pollinators such as bees and ants, as well as butterflies, which are active during this time frame, excuse me, when flowers are an important early food source. So here on this slide, you can kind of see it's an example of one specific spring ephemeral native to Minnesota's southeast region, Virginia bluebells or Mertensia virginica. So photos kind of going from left to right on the top of the slide here really show how this spring ephemeral is sort of emerging with that purple foliage kind of coming up during that early April timeframe that really kind of quickly turns green. And now, sort of that the Virginia bluebells really start to flower anywhere between kind of mid-April to early May, which really gives the plant ample time to sort of photosynthesize and store energy into their root system. So, as folks may know, right now is kind of a really good time to start seeing these. So our mertensia is really swelling with flower buds right now, so right on cue for this time of year. Now, the plant itself can grow up to 2 feet tall, but many other spring ephemerals can be much smaller. And you will be seeing a lot more examples throughout the presentation here too of other examples of spring ephemerals. But right now, here on the far right photo, kind of showcases a colony of Virginia bluebells blooming in mesic hardwoods. So when flowering like this, you can expect to see floral visitors like honeybees or bumblebees or mason bees, just to kind of name a few there. And then finally on the bottom of the screen here is a photo, really an example of Virginia bluebell plant senescing or going dormant in early summer after that seed dispersal. So what that means is they die back to their underground parts kind of by late May or June. So even though their above ground parts kind of wither away, they disappear, the plant remains alive underground, storing energy into their roots. So this dormant period lasts until the following spring when they reemerge. Now, I do want to mention that Virginia bluebells here is an example of a true spring ephemeral. So this is because it completes its life cycle before the forest leaves fully leaf out, just kind of mentioned, as I mentioned here on this slide. So this life cycle is happening during our short springtime window right now. But there are many other like early spring wildflowers that actually keep their leaves throughout the growing season and don't go dormant right away. So they're not actually considered to be true spring ephemerals, but they are lovely spring wildflowers all the same. So we'll be talking about both true spring ephemerals as well as other early spring flowers throughout the series of this presentation today. So you will be able to see examples of both. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit about their ecological role. So, spring ephemerals, they also play an important ecological role in their environment. Number one, from a soil stabilization perspective, their roots can help stabilize the soil, particularly in understory environments, where they can help prevent soil erosion during that early spring thaw. Now, as mentioned earlier, spring ephemerals and other spring wildflowers provide an important food resources for pollinators. So they're one of the first resources for nectar and pollen for pollinators like bees and butterflies that kind of emerge in that early season. So their flowers serve as an essential resource for these early season insects, supporting their survival. So third here is nutrient cycling. So as they decompose after their growing season, spring ephemerals contribute to nutrient cycling in the forest floor. And they really do so by enriching the soil and benefiting other plant species. Now, lastly here, spring ephemerals can contribute to the biodiversity of forest ecosystems. So what that means is they provide seasonal food sources for a range of animals and insects. They fill a niche as early season producers that would, not otherwise be filled by sort of those later blooming plants. Next slide, please. All right, so from a restoration ecology standpoint, spring ephemerals, they really do have several important considerations. They can act first and foremost as an indicator species for forest health. So if spring ephemerals, if they're declining or if they're missing, it could be a signal that the ecosystem is being degraded due to habitat loss or pollution or maybe invasive species. So really, protecting or reintroducing them can be part of a broader ecological restoration plan. So in areas where native understory has been disrupted, maybe due to logging, maybe it's overgrazing, maybe it's invasive species or some other disturbance, reintroducing spring ephemerals and other early spring wildflowers can help restore the ecosystem's structure and function. So that's really important there. And they can also help bring back the native biodiversity by reestablishing early spring blooms that support those native pollinators and other species. Now, while I was working at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, we partnered with the city of Chaska to bring back some of our local native biodiversity by reestablishing our sharp-lobed hepatica on some of the steep hill slopes in the Arboretum's remnant maple basswood forests. So we collected local seed using organza bags, which I've kind of shown here on that bottom right photo. And it's kind of funny because these bags were actually a really important component because without them, these seeds would have largely been dispersed by ants, making it really difficult, if not impossible, to track down. So really sort of important component there that was very helpful. But yeah, so once we collected them, we grew them out in our greenhouse for 2 to 3 years, and then we planted them on the hillsides of the Dayton Wildflower Garden, woodland, as well as the remnant maple basswood forest that sort of surrounded those spaces, as part of that local seed conservation effort, as well as the greater sort of woodland restoration that we were working on. Next slide, please. So just kind of in summary here, I just wanted to sort of mention that, spring ephemerals, they really are a vital part of our temperate ecosystem, right? They fill a unique ecological niche as early season producers. They provide a crucial ecosystem services which includes pollination, nutrient cycling, and biodiversity support. And then from a restoration perspective, these plants are valuable indicators. They play a role in habitat recovery. So, really understanding their life cycle, their ecological roles, and how they respond to environmental changes is really essential for effective conservation and restoration efforts. So, with that, my time is up here, so I'm going to hand it over to Susan for that next section of the presentation, where you're going to be able to find out where some of those early spring wildflowers are here locally, as well as some of that rich history behind these spaces. So, with that, take it away, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. And hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Again, my name is Susan Wilkins, and I am the curator at the Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden and Bird Sanctuary. Next slide, please. Sharing information about the plants and history of the wildflower garden is such a delight for me. The spring wildflowers captivate so many people's hearts, including my own, and it is a joy to be able to talk a bit about the history of the garden in the context of spring woodland wildflower identification and appreciation. Before I do that, I'd like to note that the garden is a free public botanic garden owned and operated by the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. This award-winning park and recreation agency carries out an incredible diversity of work for the community. The garden is one of the key programming sites for nature-focused programs in the park system and hosts a variety of volunteer programs, many in partnership with our amazing friends group, the Friends of the Wildflower Garden. Last year, we logged over 50,000 visitor engagements at the garden and led programs for over 6,000 visitors. We now work in partnership with the Lopet Foundation to offer winter programming opportunities with their support so that youth and adults have easy access to learn about nature all year long in Theodore Wirth Regional Park. Next slide, please. I'm going to move into a little garden history so that you understand why we have so many unique spring flowering woodland wildflowers from Minnesota and the eastern US in the wildflower garden. What is interesting to note is that the Wildflower Garden was founded through the efforts of a group of citizens, primarily a group of female science school teachers, including Eloise Butler. They wanted to create a natural botanic garden for the preservation, study, and enjoyment of the native plants of Minnesota. This happened over 100 years ago. In 1907, this group petitioned the Minneapolis Park Board to create the garden with the support of several prominent community members, including the president of the University of Minnesota at the time, Cyrus Northrop. They stated that they wanted to create a natural botanical garden for the instruction of students of botany and for the enjoyment of all lovers of nature. A few additional key goals stated in the petition were to show plants as living things, to show their adaptations to their environment, and to display in miniature the rich and varied flora of Minnesota. The group also noted that they wanted to preserve intact all the wild and natural features of the proposed garden and to avoid all appearance of artificial treatment. Their efforts were successful, and in April of 1907, the Natural Botanical Garden was born. The name changed to the Wild Botanic Garden soon thereafter. Next slide, please. So Eloise Butler, a high school botany teacher in Minneapolis, immediately became the most prominent guardian and promoter of this new botanical garden. A 1910 Minneapolis Tribune article stated that she was practically the mother of the garden. She was working as a volunteer for these first years at the garden while continuing to teach, and by 1911 it was recognized that a curatorial position was necessary to keep Eloise Butler in this important role as a paid park board staff member. Something I appreciate about this garden is how community-centered and collaborative it has been since the very beginning. To support this change, to recognize Eloise Butler's role and vision at a professional level, the Women's Club of Minneapolis and the Garden Club of Minneapolis worked to create the curator position with the park board's support. The Women's Club of Minneapolis even paid her salary for the first year to launch the role. A wonderful example of people working together to make great things happen. Next slide, please. And at this point, even more species were being introduced. Eloise truly saw the potential here and felt that the garden could rival even the best botanical gardens out east from where she was originally from. But this one was natural and full to the brim of native plants. It was nurtured with a management style that gave room for these introduced but native plants to grow as naturally as possible in the places they were planted alongside other plants. Interestingly, Eloise Butler was not trying to recreate native plant communities, but did want the garden to look wild and feel natural. I really love this. For me, I think, wow, wasn't she ahead of her time? Even still, we're catching up to such a simple in some ways and yet a very sophisticated vision for a botanical garden's plant collection goals, design aesthetic, and management style. And like any great visionary and artist, Eloise Butler built foundations and structures to create and hold meaning for the development of the garden and to carry her goals and ideas forward. And then she stepped outside of the lines she drew sometimes, right? Because at least in this instance, the world was just a little too beautiful to stay within them all of the time. So that's an important detail today because a good number of the spring woodland wildflowers that we have growing in the wildflower garden are not from Minnesota at all. And the vast majority of them, including the Minnesota native species that are present at the garden today, were introduced to the garden by Eloise Butler, our visionary, in those decades of building a new plant collection. Next slide, please. As we go through the slides to learn more about a few of the garden's cherished early bloomers, I've noted if each species was indigenous to the site, and you'll see that on each slide. I've also tried to give you a general time frame for blooming for each species in the garden. This can vary from year to year, at times significantly. So let's start the virtual walk through the garden in spring with our first bloomer this season, the snow trillium. Next slide, please. So we have 9 trillium species in the garden today. This includes the 4 species of trillium that are native to Minnesota. Snow trillium is the first of these 9 species to bloom each year, and often the first wildflower species to bloom in the garden each season. It stands roughly 2 inches tall or so and grows in small clusters here. It was planted extensively in the past. There were over 20 known introductions, known as accessions in a botanical garden, made by Eloise Butler and Martha Crone, the garden's second curator. Martha Crone worked as a volunteer with Eloise for many years and became the curator after Eloise Butler's passing in 1933. In one instance, 325 plants were recorded as being accessioned in 1945 by Martha Crone, and that is snow trillium plants. This is a species that staff at the garden are interested in trying to propagate on site in the near future. It's in flower right now, but won't be for too much longer this season, so come on out soon to see it. Next slide, please. This charismatic plant species grows naturally in wetlands and seeps and along stream banks. It's the only Symplocarpus species native to North America. This arum family plant has a unique flowering structure with flowers arranged along a spadix tucked inside of a vessel-like structure called a spathe. The species is thriving in the garden, but not indigenous to the site. The first introduction of skunk cabbage to the garden occurred in June of 1907, just a couple of months after it opened, and was taken from under the Lake Street Bridge in Minneapolis to be planted here. Next slide, please. So let's hear a little more from Eloise Butler about this plant. She wrote in an article in 1911 for the Minneapolis Tribune that you'll have great respect for Dame Nature's ability as a packer if you take apart the leaf bud made up of many leaves tightly rolled one within another and smaller at the center. The bud expands into a clump of large leaves from which the name cabbage is derived. The disagreeable odor is attractive to flies, which find a shelter from the cold within its purplish red hood-like spathe and pay rent by pollinating the flowers. The spathe, the showy part of the inflorescence, is merely a large leaf enwrapping numerous minute flowers set on a fleshy axis. It is always well to get at the roots of things. If you dig deep down into the muck, you will discover a stout subterranean stem from which spring many roots ringed like angleworms. These roots have contracted like muscles, thereby forming the rings and giving the stem a deep, safe anchorage in the earth. This is only one of the many instances of self-burial by a pull on the stem. Next slide, please. White and yellow trout lilies were introduced to the garden by Eloise Butler. They can form extensive colonies like the ones you see in the wildflower garden today. These primarily clonal plants spread by stolons, which are horizontal stems that lay close to the soil surface in the case of trout lilies, corms, which are underground storage organs similar to bulbs or tubers like potatoes, form at the ends of stolons, and the cycle repeats and continues under the right conditions. In colonies, there are often just a few flowering plants. Flowers are associated with paired leaves, so look for pairs of trout lily leaves if you're searching for flowers. Next slide, please. The yellow trout lilies are primarily found in moist, rich woods, including in the eastern part of Minnesota. These lily family plants have 6 tepals with 3 petals and 3 sepals that look like petals. The trout lilies are true ephemerals and have a brief above ground life cycle, as Annie described. I have included an accession record here in this slide for yellow trout lily from Eloise Butler. You will note that the yellow trout lily was referred to as yellow adder's tongue by Eloise Butler at the time. You can also see the type of information that she tracked when recording accessions. Next slide, please. Bloodroot is one of the woodland wildflower species that is indigenous to the garden and Theodore Wirth Regional Park, but that did not stop Eloise Butler from adding more. It was planted frequently throughout Eloise Butler's area here and has been added up to the last decade. Currently, we have scattered clusters along the woodland garden trails, and it is in bloom right now. The sap of the root is red in color, hence the genus name Sanguinaria, with the name's root in the Latin word sanguis, meaning blood. This species is often called an ephemeral, but it is not. The flowers come and go quickly, but the uniquely lobed leaves will persist well into the growing season and are a beautiful feature along the woodland trails. Next slide, please. Another species that is indigenous to the garden and Wirth Park is marsh marigold. The flowers typically have 5 to 9 richly colored yellow sepals with no petals. The sepals are overlapping and have prominent veins that serve as nectar guides for pollinators. Stamens number 10 to 40 with yellow filaments and anthers, pistils number 5 to 15. The sepals fall away during fruiting, and when walking in the wetland garden area here in late May and June, you will often notice a greenish crown-like arrangement of 5 to 15 follicles, a type of fruiting structure, that are ellipsoid in shape with a straight or curved beak at the tip, where the pistils once were. Next slide, please. I like to include information about violets because there are many native species and they're beneficial to pollinators. And for many, they're beautiful plants that come in a variety of colors. And to others, they are weeds. According to the Xerxes Society, violets are the host plant for a wide range of butterflies known as fritillaries, like monarchs whose caterpillars only feed on milkweed. The 14 species of greater fritillaries and 16 lesser fritillaries will only lay their eggs where there are violets for their larvae to feed upon. And violets are also host plants for a mining bee species that's common in the eastern US that only visits violets, although this species is not known to be present in the garden. Violets can become dominant in an area and commonly pop up in home gardens, as many of you probably know. In the Twin Cities, people often find these common blue wood violets in their shady gardens and lawns. Another common species in our area is Canada violet. This species has leaves on the stalks that bear flowers, whereas the common blue violet has no leaves on those flowering stalks. The next time you're going to pull a violet out of your garden or lawn, just remember the fritillaries and think about leaving a few. Next slide, please. So Annie mentioned the Dutchman's breeches, a delicate looking spring ephemeral with white to lightish pink flowers. It likes to grow in dappled light in rich soils. The flowers resemble a pair of pantaloons that are hanging upside down, hence the name. The foliage has a lace-like appearance, as you can see, and fades away nearly as quickly as it emerges. This plant was also an introduction to the garden, and we continue to plant it in new areas where it will thrive. This plant, interestingly, is closely related to garden variety bleeding hearts that you may be familiar with. Next slide, please. These next 2 slides are about the toothworts. So two-leaf toothwort carpets several woodland garden areas right now, and it's just starting to flower for the season. A true spring ephemeral as well. It's not indigenous to the garden. It's likely also not native to Minnesota. Another name for this mustard family plant is kringleroot, and if you stoop down and take a closer look at the soil surface, you'll notice these oblong, knobby rhizomes popping up all over, and they do look very, very crinkly. Next slide, please. Another spring ephemeral, cutleaf toothwort, is native to Minnesota and also prevalent at the garden. It's also introduced here. The flowers of the two toothwort species are very similar, with 4 white petals arranged in the shape of a cross or an X. And this petal arrangement is characteristic of plants in the mustard family. It's a fun fact to know. Next slide, please. Often confused with true rue anemone, when in flower, false rue anemone is easy to identify by the number of petal-like sepals present. False rue will consistently have 5 white sepals, while true rue will typically have 6 to 9 light pink colored sepals, sometimes even 1 or 2 more. This species grows from a weakly rhizomatous root system, which allows it to form colonies. It was introduced to the garden first in 1908, and it is presumed that most of the colonies here today are from the original introductions that Eloise Butler made from 1908 into the early 1920s. This is true of many of the species we're talking about today. Next slide, please. This birthwort family plant was introduced to the garden in May of 1907. Wild ginger has those 2-stalked heart-shaped leaves that you can see in this image that bear a solitary flower at the base of the 2 leaf stalks. The flower consists of a tube, which you can see here, formed by 3 sepals with a purplish outer color that is hairy. The inside apex of the tube is deeper in color with an intersection that is white, as you can see in this image quite well. It spreads readily even under difficult conditions like dry shade. The leaves are also fairly hardy during dry spells and can keep a woodland garden area looking green late into the growing season. It's a favorite plant of mine at the garden. Next slide, please. So Annie also talked about the Virginia bluebells, and it's a favorite species of so many. That beautiful blue color is just hard to match. I was first introduced to the garden in 1912, and it continues to be planted through the present, including this year. True ephemeral, the bell-shaped flowers that are blue can be up to 1 inch long and are pollinated by a wide variety of pollinators, including bumblebees, butterflies, hummingbird moths, and hummingbirds. Next slide, please. So we're back to the trilliums here. Some really unique species at the garden. I'll tell you just a little bit about them and then come on out for a visit and we'll tell you more. So nodding trillium was the only species native to the garden. The others were introduced. You'll notice that drooping trillium has a flower that's angled but remains above the leaves typically, whereas nodding, that picture in the middle, has a flower that really is tucked all the way underneath the leaves and faces downward. The large flower trillium has large outward facing white flowers. The petals are longer than the 3 green sepals behind them, so there appears to be more space between the petals and the sepals. Next slide, please. A popular flower at the garden, purple trillium, was introduced in 1910. This eastern species has done well in the garden and has formed dense clumps in a few garden areas. New individual plants of this species have popped up in new areas in the garden over the past 2 decades as well. We think that the corms are being moved by garden residents, such as the red and gray squirrels. So we have some garden helpers out here at the wildflower garden. Next slide, please. These additional trillium species have maroon colored flowers, and they include toadshade, little sweet Betsy, and prairie trillium. They all have mottled leaves and unique features, including very specific scents. Again, I would encourage you to join one of our free public tours. They're at 11 a.m. Tuesday through Sunday to learn more about these plants and their characteristics when they start to flower in May. Next slide, please. So our final trillium is such an interesting plant, planted by Martha Crone in the 1940s. It has the most unique scent of all. If you carefully lean over to smell the greenish yellow flowers, you, assuming that you have tasted Fruit Loops at one point in your life, you'll be shocked to find that sweet fragrance of Fruit Loops coming from these beautiful flowers. So carefully do that if you come to the garden, but it's really quite delightful. Next slide, please. Woodland phlox. This is a beautiful phlox that has 5 bluish petals, first introduced in 1907. So there's a non-native plant that can look like woodland phlox. Has become quite a problem called Dame's Rocket. I'm sure many of you know this plant. That plant is in the mustard family, so it's going to have those 4 petals. It can look very similar otherwise, and you can find it growing in similar habitats. So when in doubt, you can count it out, count those petals before deciding what to keep and what to remove. We have been planting it extensively along hillsides where a variety of weedy or invasive plants have been removed over the past 2 decades. And something that we've noticed is that it really seems to thrive on shaded west and northwest facing slopes in the garden where buckthorn and garlic mustard and vinca once grew. Next slide, please. Our final plant here for today, Mayapple. This was introduced to the garden early on in 1908. One of the largest groupings of this plant is near the entrance to the garden's visitor shelter. You may need to kneel down to see the cream-colored flowers tucked away underneath the umbrella-like leaves, and I'd say it's really worth it. So give it a try if you can. The fruit gives the plant its name, as when mature, it looks like a small apple. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share as well, if you come to visit the Wildflower Garden, we'll look so forward to seeing you out here on the trails and in the visitor shelter. We have a welcome kiosk staffed by volunteers, and you may be greeted if one is present on the day of your visit. We also have wonderful resources available, including these guides to the plants in bloom that are seasonal and garden area based. So you can pick up one of those and take it home with you if you'd like. There's also a lot of information about programs in the garden online at the garden's webpage and then at the Friends webpage as well. So thank you so much for your interest, and I'm always happy to follow up with anyone after this presentation as well if you have questions about the garden and the plant collections and what's in bloom. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Andy here.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say thank you to Annie and Susan for setting me up here. You'll see some familiar flowers in my show for you today. But my name is Andy Wendt. I am the interpretive naturalist at Nerstrand Big Woods State Park. Next slide, please. In case any of you are not familiar with Nerstrand Big Woods State Park, we're actually located just about an hour south of the Twin Cities area. We're also about an hour from places like Mankato and Rochester, so pretty short drive for quite a few folks in this area. But on the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of background on the state park. This was a park established in 1945. Set aside primarily to protect another type of ecosystem here in Minnesota known as the Big Woods. That is an ecosystem that is characterized kind of mostly of a mix of things like maple and basswood forest. Prior to the arrival of things like Dutch elm disease, American elm would have been a pretty major component as well. We are also situated kind of right along the boundary of where that Big Woods meets Oak Savanna. So we also have a good mix of 4 different species of oak trees that are kind of blended in there. So, but today the park currently sits at around 1,600 acres, and it's a great place to do a wide range of activities. Our campground just opened here recently, so camping's very popular. Picnicking is a big thing out here as well as in the winter, snowshoeing, hiking are all very popular activities. But probably one of the best, probably one of the best parks too for things like bird watching, if that's something that's interested in you or that interests you. But on the next slide, I just wanted to show you one of the areas that you can visit along our hiking trails. We have 11 miles of trail system out here. One of them takes you along Prairie Creek, which is kind of the dominant waterway through the park. Pretty shallow stream, eventually connects up to the Cannon River near where Lake Billsby is. But along Prairie Creek, that feeds into probably our most popular geologic feature, which is on our next slide here. And that's Hidden Falls. Got Platteville limestone that kind of makes up the top portion of the waterfall. And then there's a formation of shale, the Glenwood Formation, just below that. But probably our most visited section of the park, but being that our subject of our talk today is more wildflower focused, I do just like to point out that if you're looking to see the falls, you're already going to be traveling probably the best trail possible for viewing wildflowers. And we are starting to see quite a few blooms beginning to pop up. And I'll just highlight some of those plants that are popping up now here on this next slide. So what parks or plants are growing in the park and are common? On the next slide here, we'll take a look at one of the earliest we see, and this is one that has been talked about a couple of times here already in our presentation, and that's our sharp-lobed hepatica. On there, if you have a sharp eye, you may see some of those kind of burgundy color leaves that had hung over from the previous growing season. They tend to blend in pretty well with the leaf litter on the ground there. So they can be pretty easy to overlook, but this is probably the earliest plant that I see blooming out here at the park with its kind of distinct, kind of sometimes just a creamy color petals. I've seen them range all the way from pink to even a light lavender. So a little bit of variety in some of those blooms. On this next slide, you'll see some of the leaves that will persist through the summertime and will ultimately have some holdover to give you that kind of burgundy colored leaf in that previous picture. But definitely a very characteristic name. Hepatica is a kind of a reference to that liver look to these leaves. So that's a little background on how it got its name. On this next slide, we'll be seeing a plant that is really starting to take off out here. I noticed my first few blooms of this just last week. And now it's pretty easy to find bloodroot popping up throughout the forest here at the park. On the next slide, we have another one of my favorite plants. This is probably one of our few little splashes of yellow that we get this time of year. These plants are also beginning. And I know this was one that was mentioned earlier as well, and that's our marsh marigold. But very fitting name. The photo that I have here is showing just a whole bunch of them growing in just a little marshy area, kind of between Hidden Falls and our boardwalk section of Hidden Falls Trail. But on the next slide, I can show you a picture them a little closer up. So really beautiful yellow flowers that help brighten up the springtime here. So on the next slide, we've got another plant that I haven't started to see blooming yet, but it often looks pretty similar to our hepatica, and that's Virginia Spring Beauties. One of the ways I am able to tell these plants apart is taking a look at the petals of this flower. There's usually some bright pink lines that run from the tip to where it meets up at the base there. And their leaves are very different as well. They tend to be more of a grass-like look to them. So it's not popping up yet, but certainly something I would expect to see here in the near future. Next slide, please. This is going to be one of our most common plants that blooms here in the springtime. That's our false rue anemone. Definitely a beautiful little white flower, 5 petals, as was mentioned. But this will form some nice dense carpets across the forest floor. It's still kind of coming in a little bit early right now, but we're starting to see more of these plants blooming. So next slide, please. And white trout lilies, those are also one of our most common plants along with that false rue anemone. One of the nice things about visiting the park in the springtime is just seeing these carpets of trout lilies, the false rue anemone spreading out throughout the forest. But white trout lilies have gotten their name from that kind of purpley mottling that we're seeing on some of the leaves near the flowers. And um, that'll kind of fade out as the plant starts to senesce or go dormant near the usually about July or June is when I typically see that beginning to happen. But beautiful white bell-shaped flower. However, this is not the only trout lily you can see out at the park. If you'd advance the slide, please. We also have a really special plant that can be seen here in the spring, and this is the Minnesota dwarf trout lily. This plant was first discovered in 1870 by a person named Mary Hedges, and this plant takes on our state's namesake here because it is truly only found here in Minnesota. Uh, Rice, Goodhue, and Steele counties are the only areas uh, in the world that this plant can be seen in spots. Uh, Also found on along the Cannon and Straight River watersheds. So it's truly a special plant to be able to see out here at the park. And if we go on to the next slide, some just background on the plant. This plant evolved from the white trout lily, its larger relative, sometime after the last ice age. And it does have a very slow rate of reproduction. This plant only creates an extension of its underground bulb system in years that it's blooming. And on the photo here, that little bud that's pointing up, that's only about the size of a grain of rice. So quite a difference in size when comparing it to its larger relative. But uh, that slow rate of reproduction and a variety of other factors have led to this plant being listed as both state and federally endangered. But to help you kind of get a sense of the looks of these two plants, I have a photo on this next slide. So in here, there are both of our trout lilies. If you just advance it 1 second here, that little yellow arrow is pointing at the Minnesota dwarf trout lily. So not too much bigger than a pencil eraser when fully in bloom. Up above that yellow arrow, of course, is the larger relative, the white trout lily. One way to tell these two plants apart is to take a look at the tepals there. White trout lilies have 6, and the Minnesota dwarf trout lily typically only has 4 and sometimes 5 of them. But super cool little plant that's just getting ready to bloom out here. But these plants do face a lot of dangers. So if you'd advance the slide, please. A lot of threats that we see for any of these spring plants, considering that many of them have a short growing period, are things like invasive species. And we do manage a lot of invasive species at our state parks. This photo is of me in a little sea of garlic mustard that I had to hand pull. So things like that can form dense mats. Buckthorn thickets can really smother out special little plants like the Minnesota dwarf trout lily or really any of our native species. Next slide, please. And things like development have also really impact these early blooming plants. A lot of our good agricultural land, of course, is places where these plants grow. We certainly need to feed ourselves, as well as provide shelter for ourselves too. So a lot of the landscapes that these plants grow on have been developed to meet just various basic human needs. Next slide, please. And climate change also impacts our ephemerals. Um, in this part of the state, we are starting to see increasing amounts of rain being dropped and more frequent storms. And this leads not only to problems with things like erosion. Some of the finer soils that the trout lilies prefer to grow in are being washed away from these increasing rains. And it can also lead to more flash flooding. The Minnesota dwarf trout lily grows along uh, watersheds like the Cannon and Straight River, and sometimes those flash floods can begin diverting that stream path through colonies of plants. So our climate is certainly starting to trend wetter and warmer, and this can have a big impact on some of our plant communities. Next slide. But just to to re-emphasize some of the points that my previous presenters have made, these plants are vitally important. They are that early food source for things like the rusty patched bumblebee, which I have in this photo here. They do provide erosion control by slowing down some of those early rains during the spring when not much else is growing on the land. And I think another major benefit of these plants is also that they are just simply beautiful, something that we can enjoy that also is a part of our ecosystem. Next slide, please. And just to show you some of the importance for these pollinators, this is a bee that is out at the park here. Um, and the little grains of yellow that are all over it are grains of pollen from white trout lilies. So um, next slide, please. So I did mention a bunch of threats that many of these plants face, but the good news is we can actually do something to help them out. Using boot brush stations like I have in this photo here can help knock off mud and seeds from non-native plants that can spread through our ecosystems. When you're doing landscaping around your own homes, think about using native plants in those capacities, as they often require a little less maintenance than some of our cultivated plants. And then we also don't run the risk of those plants escaping the garden, kind of in the way of things like buckthorn and garlic mustard have. And then to help fight climate change, just look for little ways that we can reduce our impact at home. Every little step is a big thing. And the last thing that I like to just highlight is that we can also volunteer. Uh, Join that garlic mustard pull or buckthorn cut. Um, can be a great way to help improve habitat. And here at the park, we also have volunteers that serve as wildflower ambassadors to help people learn a little bit about plants um, and share more about the Minnesota dwarf trout lily. So, all right, next slide. With that, I do want to say thank you for taking some time to learn about spring ephemerals with me.
Great. Thank you, Andy, for leaving us with some really great tips on how we can help preserve these really beautiful spring flowers and plants. And then with that, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see our presenters. And then I'm going to just check in our Q&A to see if there are any questions. Um, we do have a question in here. And again, just a reminder that if you, there are some links that were shared in the chat, more information about the parks, and more, yeah, a lot more information about the parks in there. So if you have any questions, you can look in the Q&A section and drop them in there. One question from Richard is, what's the evolutionary advantage of having a plant come up colored purple? Is there an advantage to being able to absorb light in spring if you've got a purple color? And I think I would leave that open to either any one of you to see if you have an input on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I know that specifically, the evolutionary side of things, but I think I know, as the plant begins to photosynthesize, it does, turn green right away. I'm not sure if you were talking about the mertensia specifically, um, but yeah, as it sort of comes up and photosynthesizes, that it sort of takes in and creates that chlorophyll to make that green color in the leaves.
Great. Thank you. Andy or Susan, do you have anything to add about the purple color?
Nothing that comes to my mind.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead,
Oh,
Susan.
I was just gonna, we were actually just talking about this, the staff at the garden and I, and it's something that we want to look into a little further. I think there might be kind of a protective quality to that, the anthocyanins as well early in the spring. So I think we'll all have to look into this and learn it for ourselves, it looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question. Susan Warfield wanted to make a note to pitch in the Master Naturalist program for those that are wanting to help. So that is a really great program to get involved with. Um, and let's see. She also made a comment that blues and purples draw bees more than other colors do. So that they see the blue light very vividly. And I believe this question from C says that the slides and links, will they be in Q&A and the chat be sent out? I believe that's the question, if I'm understanding that correctly. And I think we can, those will not be sent out. The slides won't be sent out, but we'll have this webinar recorded on YouTube, and so you can find that on our website in our archive section, and that should be up shortly within the week. And then Devin has a question, and Devin said, would these plants make a good type of ground cover for a city lot?
Was there a particular species mentioned by chance?
No particular species, but maybe from the standpoint of, yeah, from like a restoration standpoint. So would they be a good type of ground cover?
I would, if I pipe in briefly, I think it would depend on the species that you're talking about, but there are some, and if you're thinking about a shaded area, there are some plants that are readily available, like the wild ginger that I mentioned, that makes a fabulous ground cover, really reliable, really tough, and again, pretty easy to purchase as well. So I might start there and just establish that, and then you could start adding in different plants. Annie's nodding her head.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just considering, your site conditions is also really important. So kind of what soil you have, and then as well as what Susan mentioned with some of those light conditions for being able to kind of understand what plant selection would be beneficial. I know Susan also mentioned some of the native violets that we have here as well that, if you're really trying to create a ground cover, some of our native violets can be a good way to sort of spread around and whatnot. I've also, depending if it's more of a sunnier location, there are other sort of species that we didn't touch on from of those spring blooming species, but prairie smoke is another one that can be a really nice ground cover if it's, in a sunnier location or something like that. So taking some time to consider those site locations and whatnot, but there are definitely some great options for ground cover or utilizing like a living mulch for some of your urban spaces.
Great, thank you. So we have about we're actually out of time, and I know there are just a couple more questions left in there. But thank you everybody so much for joining us, and thank you to our guest speakers today. That was really wonderful and great information, and thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge on spring ephemerals, and even just the places that you work at and all of the wonderful work that you do there. Thank you for everyone that's here today attending the webinar. For make sure that next time you register or next week you actually register for our next episode, so episode 210. In the next episode, we're going to have Kelly Randall and Judy Eber from our scientific and natural areas who will be joining us to share some of these special places, how to responsibly visit these places, and what you can do to help conserve these special places. So we hope you can get out now that you have some idea of what some of these spring ephemerals look like. It's a beautiful day, and so hope you can get out to take a look and find some spring ephemerals, and we hope to see you next week.